Okay, so welcome everyone to the latest talk in the RACS network. This week we have Chelsea Haramia joining us. She's an associate professor of philosophy and director of gender studies at Spring Hill College. She'll soon be joining the team at the University of Bonn, working as a senior research fellow on the Desirable Digitalisation, Rethinking AI for Just and Sustainable Futures project. Sounds very exciting. Her current research focuses on AI ethics, the ethics of space exploration, and the ethics of science and technology. So right up our street, as well as environmental ethics, environmental justice, feminist philosophy, bioethics, and public philosophy. She's also co-editor of the online journal 1000 Word Philosophy, and she brings the benefits of philosophical inquiry to area children through her award-winning Philosophy for Children service learning course.
That was more common when there wasn't a pandemic, actually.
Okay. Well, do feel free to plug anything that you want to plug, Chelsea, but I think with all of that said, over to you, and yeah, we're in your capable hands.
Okay. Is it all right if I share my screen with you all now?
Absolutely.
I'll pull up my slides. And does that look okay to everyone? Okay, then let's get started. So thank you all for having me here today to speak to the network. I'm excited, and I'm going to talk about astrobiological searches for life and shared knowledge. And I'm going to cover a few, I think, different but related issues in maybe some novel ways, and hopefully give us some fodder to mull over, to chew over, to think about. We're thinking about kind of the nature of the stuff that is out there in the universe. And so here are a couple of key questions that I'm going to cover. First, what's the nature of value, right? So axiology, that seems like a great thing to think about. What's the nature of life? This is an astrobiology talk, right? And so these biological questions are important as well. And the nature of those explorations are going to relate to the nature of other kind of important things, but the main foci are going to be value in life. And then what kind of knowledge can we expect to share with extraterrestrial intelligent life? So insofar as there's life out there that has consciousness, right, that we can share knowledge with, that we can share potential understandings with, what might we have good reason to expect that we have overlap in terms of our understandings or our knowledge? And so I'm going to start by thinking about the specific branch of astrobiology known as SETI, right? Astrobiologists search for extraterrestrial life. SETI practitioners search for extraterrestrial intelligent life, right? Now, what they're searching for is specifically evidence of extraterrestrial technology. And so intelligence in the SETI acronym, right, that's a proxy for technology. That's what they're looking for. And then the idea, right, is that, if we detect technology, it's sufficient to think that whatever life created that technology was intelligent. They don't, I believe, argue that that technology is necessary for intelligence, right? I think they're much more open about what's required for intelligence. And as we'll see, as I move on, right, we don't have a kind of a good cut and dry, neat and tidy understanding of the concept of intelligence itself. But, insofar as we detect technology, there does seem to be good reason to think then that what created that technology had some kind of intelligence. And so this is what SETI researchers set out to do. And so the SETI Institute, which kind of founded the study of SETI and is the seed for all the offshoots now of institutes that will search for extraterrestrial intelligence and technology. They have a mission, and their mission is, quote, to explore, understand, and explain the origin and nature of life in the universe and the evolution of intelligence. Okay, so sounds good, sounds astrobiological with a little bit of technology and intelligence thrown in there. Now, I'm an ethicist, and so, it stands out to me that absent from this mission is any mention of the search for extraterrestrial values, right? Now, this is not surprising, right? But it's the kind of thing that I want to draw our attention to, right? So we are on board with the search for things like life and intelligence out in the cosmos. I'm going to argue that on pain of consistency, we should actually be equally on board with the search for extraterrestrial values, right? And then it's just kind of equally likely for us to expect to be able to find these kinds of things out in the cosmos. Okay, so let's think about values and life and these different kinds of searches. So I want you all to consider the following two claims. Claim one. Values are the kind of thing that we can hope to identify elsewhere in the cosmos because values and ethics are not things that humans just made up. Okay, I think there's actually a lot of skepticism about this claim, right? I think especially scientists are pretty deeply skeptical of the idea of universal or objective or extraterrestrial values. A lot of lay people, I think, are skeptical, and we'll talk later about why. Folks, there's just kind of a tendency, notable tendency to be skeptical of the truth of claim one here. And now consider claim two. Life is the kind of thing we can hope to identify elsewhere in the cosmos because life is not something that humans just made up. This is definitely an assumption that astrobiologists are operating under, right? Even if they're not, 100% certain, they feel justified, right, in assuming the truth of this. There's not nearly as much skepticism, I don't think, about claim one as there is about claim two. So lots of folks are on board with claim two. It's the kind of thing we can hope to find out there. Lots of folks deeply skeptical of claim one. Okay, now I'm going to argue that these claims should actually kind of stand and fall together. And to the extent that you're skeptical of claim one, you should be equally skeptical of claim two. The extent that you're willing to accept claim two, you should be equally willing to accept claim one. So let's think about this. Here we have claim one, the claim about value. So why might people be skeptical of this claim? Well, there's a nice little quote here from E.O. Wilson, Michael Roos, that captures a lot of what is behind some of the skepticism. So morality, or more strictly our belief in morality, merely an adaptation put in place to further our reproductive ends. Hence, the basis of ethics does not lie on God's will or in any part of the framework of the universe. In an important sense, it's an illusion, right? Fobbed on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. And so the idea here, right, is that ethics is just a byproduct of our evolution. It's a kind of purely human construct, and therefore it's earthbound, right? And it's not the kind of thing we can expect to find elsewhere. So let's think about why people might be skeptical of claim two, right? Not as much actual skepticism about this, but insofar as one might be skeptical, why would they be justified? Well, here's a quote from Carol Cleland and Elspeth Wilson. Our current understanding of life as a natural phenomenon, based solely on our experience with life here on Earth, is myopically Earth-centric. We have a sample size of one, right? We only know about life. It's possible that life is earthbound, right? And that there's no life anywhere else. And so that's reason to be skeptical of claim two, right? It evolved here on Earth, but just because it evolved here on Earth, why should we assume that it evolved elsewhere? Okay, so here's my appeal for consistency. The search for life, including technologically advanced life, it's nonetheless justified. I think that folks understand that it's possible, at least, that life is earthbound, that evolved here and nowhere else, but that doesn't justify giving up the search, right? That doesn't justify an overall credence in the assumption that it doesn't exist everywhere. There's some reason to think that life exists elsewhere beyond Earth in the universe, and that reason is the fact that there is life here is at least some evidence that it evolved elsewhere as well. And so the same can be said of values. Because ethical values evolved here on Earth, that's some evidence that they could evolve elsewhere. And so I think we should be kind of equally on board with claim one and claim two. So one might kind of counter really quickly here and say, well, okay, evolution is the cause of life here on Earth. Evolution is the cause of our holding ethical values and beliefs here on Earth. But maybe evolution played different roles, right, in these things. And so you might worry that there is a relevant distinction between these two claims, and that we can drive a wedge between the parallel that I tried to draw. So let's think, what role might evolution be playing? And there's two kinds of roles that evolution can be playing that I want to highlight here that we can then maybe apply to value and life. So the first I call accurate perception. And according to accurate perception, We evolved to have certain capabilities that enable us to recognize some objective facts about the world. Evolution is the cause of these specific capabilities, and these capabilities have been evolutionarily advantageous, of course, but they generate true, objectively true beliefs about the world. And so, for example, we evolved to have the capacity for sight. And so we can correctly, objectively recognize things, objects as near or far. And so in this image, this woman might correctly identify that the bowl of candy is within arm's reach, that it's nearby, right? And so that's a true belief about the world that she evolved to be able to kind of apprehend or access based on, evolution providing us with this particular sensory capability, just typically. And so the other role that evolution might be playing is the role of mere adaptation. So according to mere adaptation, some beliefs are merely subjective beliefs about the world. Our evolving the way we did generated these beliefs. And so evolution is the cause of certain beliefs, and these beliefs are held only because they're evolutionarily advantageous, not because they are objectively true, right? And so example of this is the idea that we believe that fats and sugars are tasty because it was once evolutionarily advantageous for us to eat such foods, right? But we could have evolved differently, and then it wouldn't be true that fats and sugars are tasty, right? And there's no kind of greater, larger, more objective truth about fats and sugars. It's just, kind of a purely evolutionary adaptation. And so, okay. What role is evolution playing in these two concepts we're thinking about in value and life? What we want to ask is, okay, what makes our beliefs or claims about value true, and what makes our beliefs or claims about life true, right? And so that evolution played a vital causal role in our beliefs, right? It doesn't entail that evolution is the explanation for the truth of those beliefs. So one could deny the conjunction of claim 1 and claim 2 by saying, okay, human beliefs are not the ultimate source of our concepts of life, right? We evolved to have capabilities that allowed us to recognize objective truths about, biology. And the source of those truths lie outside of human minds and human concepts. And then they might say, okay, but assuming, we're going to assume that human beliefs are the ultimate source of our concepts of value, meaning these value concepts arose directly from kind of human concepts, human understanding, and there's no kind of greater or outside source of truth when it comes to value claims. Okay, so why make these assumptions? On the one hand, we have beliefs about the conditions required for things like life or even intelligence, but of course, it's possible that the source of these beliefs is merely our having evolved to interpret the world in the way that we do. We call things alive. Maybe that's just an earthly custom, right? Maybe that's just something subjective about us, and there's not real life out there. On the other hand, it's possible that our evolving the way we did caused us to be capable of recognizing true, objective, ethical facts about the world, facts that exist independently of human beliefs about them. We call things good or bad. Maybe they're genuinely good or bad, right? And so we have these assumptions, but it seems kind of just as easy to make the non-standard or atypical assumptions about things like life and value. And I want us to consider the following analogy to help us understand that we have kind of equally good reason to believe that accurate perception justifies not only the understanding of the role of evolution in our concepts of life, but also the role of evolution in our understanding of concepts of value. So 2 + 2 = 4, right? That's widely agreed to be true. Of course, evolution is what caused us to be able to comprehend the truth of this, right? It granted us certain higher order thinking capabilities that allow us to understand that 2 + 2 = 4. But, a really common understanding of math is that you're not just studying human concepts, you're studying something that's real, that 2 + 2 really equals 4, regardless of human beliefs about this equation, and that it, 2 + 2 = 4 well before humans existed and will continue to be true long after we're gone. And so the idea that evolution is the kind of cause of our being able to understand this doesn't mean that it's the source of the truth of this claim. Now, of course, anti-realist philosophers and even some mathematicians, right, are going to remain skeptical of the reality of things like Platonic numbers, right? But the typical understanding is that this stuff is real, right? It's relatively uncontroversial to claim that evolution played a vital causal role in our ability to have accurate mathematical beliefs. These mathematical truths exist outside of and prior to our beliefs and evolutionary history. And this is why some folks think that these are the kinds of things we can hope to share understandings of with extraterrestrial intelligence, that maybe they'll understand basic mathematical equations and their truth, because these are truths that exist kind of in the universe, and there aren't just, earthbound or bound to human concepts. Of course, the artificial symbols that we ascribe to these concepts of two-ness and four-ness and all of that, those are very earthbound and human-centric, but the concepts behind them, right? Those are the kinds of things that are typically assumed to be universal. At least it would be very difficult to motivate the study of mathematics if we thought it was, just as much of a human construct as like poetry or something. Okay, so these mere adaptation concerns, well, we have them regarding value. And we have them for, I think, good reasons. It's not, out of the question or completely unreasonable to be skeptical about, real value. And they come from the fact that our axiological understandings can be inaccurate, right? Hitler believed that genocide was good, right? We do think that people can have inaccurate understandings of what's good or bad. And of course, our axiological understandings can be incomplete. I don't think anyone claims to have perfect moral knowledge, and that's very understandable. And we can disagree about the truth of axiological value claims. And in fact, there seems to be a lot of disagreement. And so there's reason to think then that, oh, maybe it's all just a human construct. However, we don't apply that same degree of skepticism to kind of the equal problems in the realm of math. So of course, our mathematical understandings can be inaccurate. This is very common. We've all been inaccurate in our mathematical understandings before. Even expert mathematicians can be mistaken. Our mathematical understandings can be incomplete. We don't think we have perfect mathematical knowledge. We're, still working toward greater and greater understandings of how mathematics works. And then of course, experts and humans can disagree about the truth of mathematical claims. There are whole books devoted to unsolved mathematical problems. And so we can compare this to things like life and intelligence as well, where we also have inaccurate, incomplete understandings about which there's a lot of disagreement. And just in science in general, there's a lot of disagreement. And this disagreement, these possibilities, they don't typically cause us to then look at things like science and math and say, oh, well, science doesn't study anything real. Math isn't about anything real that exists outside of human minds because there's the possibility for our inaccuracy, or we have incomplete understandings, or there's disagreement. And so if this doesn't cause us to abandon, the assumption that scientists are still studying real things, they can be mistaken, but they can also get closer to objective truths, right? If that doesn't cause us to abandon that assumption, then on pain of consistency, I don't think we should abandon assumptions about, the possibility that when we think about and study value, we're thinking about something real that really exists independently of humans. And so when we think about things like disagreement, we should also consider the flip side, right? There's a lot that scientists agree about, right? There's a lot that mathematicians agree about. There's actually a lot of basic or very general moral claims about which there is a significant agreement, across human cultures, geography, etc. And so claims such as gratuitous suffering is bad, right? There's actually a lot of agreement about that, right? That seems to be the kind of thing that is true. And then there's disagreement maybe about what counts as gratuitous or what counts as suffering. But if it is in fact gratuitous suffering, it seems bad. Joy is good. Another one that seems kind of sort of intuitively very true. And so we have lots of agreement in both of these realms as well that give us some I guess at least intuitive sense that we're tracking real things in the world, right? That aren't merely mere adaptations or simple human constructs. And so here's another appeal for consistency. That evolution plays a role in the content of our beliefs. That doesn't entail that those beliefs must be mere adaptations, right? We can evolve to have beliefs that are objectively true. Evolution causes us to be able to, use our senses to understand these truths about the world, but they're still true independently of our understandings of them. It's a possibility. Mere adaptation concerns are there, but they're there for all of the arenas we're kind of looking at, and they're comparable across these arenas. And so mere adaptation concerns, while they may be a challenge, they're no more challenging for the ethicists advocating for the search for extraterrestrial values than they are for the scientists advocating for the search for extraterrestrial life or intelligence. And so, again, believe that claim 1 and claim 2 stand and fall together. And so insofar as we are on board with the project of searching for extraterrestrial life, on the hope that, it's not a mere adaptation, that we believe life exists. And on pain of consistency, we also are justified in the search for extraterrestrial values on the hope that it's not just a mere adaptation, that we believe values exist. So here's a related important kind of worry, right? So our value concepts are determined to some extent by our sensory capabilities, right? And our sensory capabilities are very much contingent on how we've evolved, right? Whether we have things like sight or hearing or what have you, right? These are particular ways that humans evolved, and even here on Earth, right? That's not all organisms evolved to have all the same sensory capabilities. We have, birds that have sight, but it's, much different and much better than our eyesight in terms of distance or things like that. We have species that evolved to have sensory capabilities we don't have, like echolocation or whatever. And so we can think, here on Earth, our sensory capabilities are very specific and even specific to our species. And elsewhere in the cosmos, who knows what the sensory capabilities are that have evolved in other extraterrestrial creatures, right? Humans evolved in a very specific cosmic setting, a cosmic setting that informs our value concepts. Extraterrestrial life and intelligence likely evolved in a much different setting. And so we can't assume we'll be able to recognize, I'm going to move this stuff, recognize or comprehend extraterrestrial values, right? So this is a challenge to the claim that, oh, we're legitimately justified in searching for this stuff. Well, what makes us think we'll be able to identify it? Okay, that's a reasonable worry. There's the exact same worry for the search for life and intelligence, right? This is an equally legitimate worry for other areas. So extraterrestrial intelligence may have evolved to appear differently enough from what we call life and intelligence that we're unable to recognize it, even if it really exists out there, right? That's a possibility. I think astrobiologists, SETI scientists, they're aware of this possibility. They often acknowledge that we're looking for what we know because we can't look for what we don't know. But also the search is still justified, right? So even if life and intelligence are real things that really exist, that aren't mere human constructs, and are out there in the cosmos, accurate perception doesn't help, right? We may have evolved to have sensory capabilities that fail to provide us with the capability to accurately perceive things like life and intelligence elsewhere, at least some instances of those things. And so even if we go with, if we reject the mere adaptation and we operate under the assumption of accurate perception, we still can worry that we're not capable of recognizing what's really out there, right? And so I think that the search for life and intelligence is justified despite these epistemic challenges. Of course, we should acknowledge them. Of course, we should recognize that life isn't going to look, we can't just assume that life's going to look exactly like us, or that we're going to definitely be able to perceive it or understand it as life or as intelligence. But we're justified in looking, right? We're justified in searching for what we do know and hoping that, we are kind of capable of, or increasingly capable of, identifying these things. It doesn't justify abandoning the search. And so the problems are parallel, right? It may be the case that ETI evolved in a much different setting, and therefore they evolved to have much different kind of understandings of value. or understandings of value that we can't recognize. And so because this is a possibility doesn't mean we should abandon the search for extraterrestrial values any more than it means that possibility for the search for life and intelligence justifies abandoning those searches. Therefore, again, these things stand and fall together. The search for shared values is justified just as much as the search for life and intelligence remains justified. Again, there's worries, but they're not enough to abandon these searches altogether. So here's some little take-home lessons from this part. So we have things like disagreement that motivate mere adaptation concerns, but disagreement's common in scientific, mathematical, and axiological debates. Disagreements in science and math don't typically cause us to abandon belief in the possibility of real scientific or mathematic truths, right? They don't prove them, but they don't, you know, cause us to abandon the belief in these possibilities. And so if we're worried about consistency, right, we should say, okay, there is also a possibility of real axiological truths, right? And then, of course, there are basic scientific, mathematical, and axiological claims about which there's little to no disagreement, right? You are alive. There's little disagreement about that. 2 + 2 = 4. Gratuitous suffering is bad. There are claims about which there's little to no disagreement, and to deny them requires some very implausible and counterintuitive foundational assumptions, right? So we should, of course, be careful to control for biases, right? Understanding that we can be anthropocentric, we can be culturally biased, we can be personally biased. There's all sorts of ways in which, how we evolved and how we were brought up can affect our attitudes and our beliefs about all sorts of things, including science, math, and of course, ethics and values. But that means that we should, kind of attempt to control for these biases as much as we can. That doesn't by itself mean that we should just assume we never know anything at all, right? And so we should be careful to control regardless of what we're searching for, whether it's life, technology, mathematics, or values. And so the pursuit of real shared scientific and mathematical knowledge is justified. Again, I think a lot of folks are on board with this. At the same time, and on pain of consistency, the pursuit of real shared ethical knowledge is likewise justified. And so that's why claims 1 and 2 stand and fall together. And insofar as you're on board with astrobiological searches and SETI searches, you should be equally on board with the search for extraterrestrial value. Okay. Now let's think specifically about astrobiological searches, because a lot of this has been kind of focused on parallels between value and life. But of course, I treat life as, this thing we have a good understanding of and believe we're justified in searching for. But if you talk to any good astrobiologist, you know that what is life is a really kind of complicated and unsettled question. And so all scientific attempts to define life, they face some serious counterexamples. And this is a problem for, just kind of definitions of natural kinds in general. But life consistently resists understandings that operate under the assumption that it refers to, a natural kind. And so I'm just going to read a quick quote here if I can find it. So according to, again, this is Cleland and Wilson, saying that metabolic, Darwinian, thermodynamic, biochemical, cybernetic, and autopoietic attempts to define life all face serious counterexamples, right? And so we've done a lot of empirical scientific work to try to pin down, what life is, including potentially necessary and sufficient conditions for life. And this is typically because we believe that life really exists out there and it's something we can really understand, and that it's a natural kind, which means that we don't just rely on human concepts for our understanding, that this is something that exists out in the real world, and that an understanding of our human concept of that thing is not enough to understand the thing itself. So this is a problem, and we've had difficulty in understanding what life is and kind of coming to a clear consensus or even definition of life. Now, what are the alternatives if we consider the possibility that life is not a natural kind? So one alternative is that the concept of life is a mere human construct, right? And this is why it's difficult to kind of pin down a scientific definition. And so that is one alternative. It kind of flies in the face of everything we know or assume about biology, right? But it's a possibility. The other alternative, this is rarely considered, but it's the one that I'd like us to consider here. The possibility that life is real, independent of human minds, it's not a human construct, but also that it's not a natural kind that's amenable to empirical analysis. And so this is the possibility that I think we should consider, in part because I think it's not as commonly considered or assumed, and I think it's worth at least thinking through. And so here's my contention, right? It seems possible, at least, that life is what I'll call a non-observable. And so, you know, we see organisms out in the world. We see them, employ movement and growth and reproduction and certain molecular and metabolic processes. But that's not the same as perceiving aliveness or life itself, right? And so in the same way that, say, we see hands on a clock move ticking by, but we don't literally perceive time itself, right? We may also see various processes of plants and animals, but not life itself. And then again, by extension and in consistency, for the sake of consistency, we perceive, concrete actions of, say, genocidal agents, but not badness itself. So maybe these things all exist in the same kind of non-observable way, where we see manifestations that are observable, but we don't observe the thing itself, time, life, value, etc. So that's the proposal. And so why I think that this is the case with life? Well, there's reason to believe that we learn about life similarly to how we learn about things like value or math or time. And so consider the fact that if on another planet we find a clear, odorless, tasteless, potable liquid that's not composed of H2O, we'll have found something other than water, right? But if we find entities that exhibit some of the characteristics of life on Earth, but lack, say, the chemical or molecular foundations of earthly life, that by itself is not reason to conclude that we found something other than life, right? And so maybe this is reason to think that life is real, but it's not a natural kind. And we've been kind of erroneously considering it as a natural kind, which is part of why it's been so difficult to pin down exactly what it is in an empirical or scientific sense. Okay, so in sum, counts of life reliably and fundamentally evade empirical definitions. This is just something we've noticed. With enough, empirical study, we can pin down natural kinds in a lot of cases. But life seems to be avoiding that, even with a lot of both philosophical and scientific or empirical study, in much the same way that mathematical phenomena fundamentally evade empirical definitions, right? And so if biological, axiological, mathematical entities are real, maybe they're all real in the same way, in this non-observable manner, where we use what Andrew Davis calls prehension, right? Where we understand, but it's not in the way that we typically apprehend the world through our senses. It's in, a much more cognitive way. And so I'll consider here then an objection from uncertainty. So if we can't empirically study something, it's hard to pin down, exactly what we should be searching for, exactly what it is we have in mind when we go looking out in the cosmos. The search for extraterrestrial life or values or intelligence, perhaps it's unfounded or fundamentally misguided, given that we're crucially unsure of what we're looking for. We can't kind of show anybody a picture, give anybody a scientific account of exactly what we need to be finding. So this is too quick, right? And this kind of concern doesn't undermine our confidence in the easy cases. So we can't tell you kind of exactly what two-ness is in any sort of empirical way, the number two, right? But that doesn't stop people from thinking that perhaps there is, a concept of, or the understanding of two or two-ness out there in the universe, and that ETI may be in a position to understand things like even numbers versus odd numbers, or that 2 + 2 = 4, because these are the easy cases. And so this kind of concern is, it's a concern for things like value, other non-observables. It's, really difficult to understand what exactly time is, what exactly goodness is, badness, etc., because these things exist in a way that kind of flies in the face of scientific or entirely or solely scientific analysis. And so this doesn't mean that we don't have confidence in the really easy cases. If 2 + 2 = 4, and that still seems true even if we can't empirically study the number 2, if joy is good, gratuitous suffering is bad, if that is true, even if we can't throw joy and suffering under a microscope, right, and study it in a scientific way, then we should also be able to have confidence that these things are worth looking for still, right? This doesn't justify abandoning the search. And so the parallel I have in the paper is, we see the 2 moons of Mars, Phobos and Deimos, and we don't see 2-ness, right? But we understand that there are 2 of them there, and we understand the truth of the claim 1 + 1 = 2, and we can use kind of scientific or sensory capabilities to reach understandings, but we don't observe 2-ness itself, just like we don't observe badness itself, even if we observe genocidal acts, for example, or things like that. And so we may assign a high degree of credence to certain claims about non-observables. And this is why there's excellent reason to search for what we do understand, while of course maintaining some epistemic humility and an acknowledgement of all that we don't understand, or our potential biases and things like that. So in summary, we're justified in searching for real non-observables such as life, value, mathematics. This maybe complicates the search, doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but it does mean it's justified, right? And then therefore, we're justified in pursuing evidence of shared knowledge between humans and extraterrestrial others, specifically the kind of understandings we have with respect to real non-observables, such as life, value, and mathematical truths. And so because if these things are real, and they're really out there, and they just have a kind of a different nature from, purely empirically apprehendable things, then we are justified in hoping, at least, that other extraterrestrial entities are kind of capable of accessing those same understandings as well. And so here's an implication for communication if we ever are in a position to communicate with ETI. If the opportunity arises, there's reason to focus our communication on topics about which we believe we may possess shared understandings, right? There's so much possibility of what communication can involve. Narrowing it down to the stuff that might really exist out there that anyone could potentially use apprehension actually to understand. That's the kind of stuff we should be potentially trying to communicate about, to see if there is shared understanding. If ETR are alive and communicating, we have good reason to at least begin our communication with a focus on these kinds of non-observables. Good reason to hope our basic understandings of them are shared. And then if we do discover they're shared, that's some prima facie evidence that these things are real, right? That they're not just kind of earthbound or merely human constructs. It's not a guarantee, but it is some good evidence in that, toward that conclusion. And so here's a quote from Holmes Rolston, thinking about, what we should be looking for if we're thinking about the possibility of shared understandings. And he says, scientists have what Michael Polanyi calls universal intent. They hope for theories true at all times and places, true for all peoples everywhere. If this is true in science, we can also ask whether the human mind can reach ethical principles that may transcend our somatic embodiment. It might be that in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, the question to ask is about the value of pi, the atomic number of carbon, right? These mathematical or scientific, seemingly objective truths. But another more revealing test might be whether one should tell the truth, keep promises, or be just, right? Maybe they have these axiological understandings as well. And there's maybe equal reason to think that those are the kinds of ideas or beliefs that we might share, and understandings that we might have in common. And so I will kind of sign off there and take any questions you have. And thank you so much for your time today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Chelsea. That was really, yes, absolutely. A round of applause. That was really, really interesting. And yeah, I enjoyed that very much. And I've certainly got a few questions, but I certainly don't want to hog it. So does anybody else want to jump in first? Ted?
Chelsea, I love listening when you speak because I always hear an insight I didn't have before, and I really appreciate what you had to say about objectively real non-observables. I think it's a really illuminative concept. A comment,
novel, at least, yeah.
question. That quotation from E.O. Wilson and Michael Roos, it really is at the nub of the evolutionary explanation. And one time I was in a room and I quoted that very quote. Yeah. Michael Roos was in the room and he rolled his eyes and he, oh no, I never said that.
So he said he never said that?
I didn't have a chance to ask him afterward exactly what he meant by that, but it really is gives us a focus on what the evolutionary explanation requires.
Yeah, I mean, I do apologize if he didn't actually say that, but that is a sentiment, right? We know that sentiment is out there, yeah.
That's right. So if you're going to argue that something we take for granted is an illusion, the burden of argument's on you. So my question now, in light of all that you've said, if tomorrow you are engaged in communication with an extraterrestrial intelligent civilization,
sounds fun,
and you are looking for these objectively real non-observables, are you going to expect that ETI will have a value system that is evolutionarily adaptive or not, or will that be irrelevant to your inquiry? What's your disposition when you're talking to ET?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that it's, certainly possible that we have, objectively true, kind of real ethical understandings and a set of those, and that our evolutionary history caused us to kind of arrive at this set of true things, but that a different evolutionary kind of situation could cause ETI to then arrive at, perhaps a completely different set, or a set that only overlaps slightly, or things like that, of still, real, objective truths about things like value, but that, we don't actually have as much shared understanding as we might expect. And that seems possible and still maintains the assumptions of kind of realness and, non-observableness of this stuff. But this, I think, is the kind of thing that we can also worry about when it comes to things like math, right? And so I think, I forget who it was who proposed, like, what if ETI evolved to have sensory capabilities that cause them to apprehend the world primarily through olfactory means? And so
my dog Danny perceives the world through her nose too.
Yeah. And so what do you think her understanding of math is? And so the suggestion was, like, what if that creates, mathematical understandings that have just a much different basis, where they think about quantities or amounts in terms of gradations instead of discrete numerals or things like that, right? And so that's another instance where no one would be wrong, we just have kind of different sets of understandings or mathematical beliefs that are correct, but they don't have a lot of overlap because of evolution causing us to apprehend the world in different ways. And so these don't create any guarantees, for shared values, but they also don't create any guarantees for shared understandings in all these other areas where we do think we're still, like, looking at real things, studying real things, trying to find real things. And so I agree that, that's a worry. And I don't know, the hope is that there's some overlap, and that it gives us some evidence. But whatever we find, it'll be some evidence, kind of in one way or the other. And, like, that would be so valuable, of course. But even if we don't find, evidence of shared values, I think that doesn't automatically mean they're not real, just like failure to find evidence of shared mathematical understandings,
Right,
that
right.
wouldn't mean those things aren't real. Yeah, thanks, that's a good question.
Shall I jump in next?
Go for it.
I had a quick clarificatory question. Were you saying that life is not a natural kind, or are you saying that life is not an observable natural kind? If that makes sense.
Life is not a natural kind, and then if it's not, it then potentially exists as a non-observable. And so existing as a non-observable means that we don't ever apprehend with our senses life itself, or life per se, or aliveness. And so you can see an organism, you can see a plant growing, you can see movement, you can see reproduction, you can observe all of these kind of physical features, or you can do empirical study of things that possess aliveness, but you don't ever see or observe the aliveness itself, just in the same way that you don't see time, right? You see evidence of, the existence of time in, physical manifestations, but that's the suggestion, right? Maybe it's real, but it's not the kind of thing we think it is. And this can explain why it's been so difficult to understand exactly what life is. But that difficulty, makes a lot more sense if it's the kind of thing we can't just kind of pinpoint with our senses, like one would hope otherwise.
I guess then, just to push back against that a little bit, I guess,
Yeah.
what would your account of natural kinds be? Because another example that strikes me as being very, very similar, and thus would, it seems to me, by that account also be a non-observable, but which is clearly a natural kind, would be something like the concept of a species, being a tiger.
Yeah.
We never actually observe tigerness. We observe individual tigers. We observe the fur and the skin cells and the way they move and the way they reproduce, exactly as we do with life. But we still believe there is this natural kind called tiger.
Yep.
So now, if you'd said they're non-observable natural kinds, I don't think I'd have a quarrel with it. It was like, but I guess I don't see why you've concluded it's not a natural kind. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think, good. No, that's a really great challenge. And so I think the idea behind concluding it's not a natural kind is this idea that, with enough kind of just scientific study, we can pin down what a natural kind is. And that's precisely where life seems to be evasive, right? Seems to evade our concerted, sustained efforts at that kind of study. But I do agree with the kind of overlap in what natural kinds are in comparison to these other things, in that they're the kinds of things that exist outside, they're not just reducible to human concepts. And so tiger's a great example, but I also think that, that kind of makes me think maybe species are non-observable in this way, species themselves. And so we observe individual instances or instantiations of tigerness, but we don't observe tigerness itself. We just, so, I mean, that kind of sounds like a great, maybe there's other stuff that that we need more than just scientific study to understand. And part of, species are another thing that are kind of evasive in terms of, we have a lot of working definitions of species, but we don't have scientific consensus on just species per se, right? And what makes a species different from another species. Rolston, of course, says that they're dynamic natural kinds that are real, but kind of constantly changing. And, that assumes that they're natural kinds, because I think that's just a really common assumption about this stuff, because we do kind of study them or access our understandings of them primarily through science, but perhaps it's more than that, right? Perhaps they are kind of another good example of this kind of thing that seems like a natural kind, but actually is part of this other category that we're not used to thinking about these scientific things as, but that's my proposal. And I understand that it's very uncommon, but that's something I think that's at least worth considering. But thank you. That's a really great point.
Well, sounds like there might be a paper in that.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it would be, yes, maybe via email we can bat that around a bit more, because yeah,
Definitely.
and that might explain why the species problem is so intractable.
Right. Yeah, it is one of
We're
those.
going around assuming it's a natural kind, or the species a natural kind, but maybe they're not. At least they're not natural kinds in the way that some other things uncontentiously are. But then, of course, then
Right.
then what would an uncontentious natural kind? Yeah, it'd be. Yeah.
I mean, I think water is the classic example, right? Yeah, but that one took us a while. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But even that one, there's debate around with. Yeah.
Of course.
Going
Yeah.
back to Turkey, and then you've got turquoise. Not turquoise. Jade, isn't it? Jade is an example where it's less clear because there's actually two sorts, which we didn't. That gets very technical, though. Maybe we can exchange some emails about.
Well, and I mean, all of that goes back to a kind of a different point, aside from the natural kind stuff, is this idea that there's all kinds of like unsettled, debate in science, and people don't then think, well, we're not studying real things then, right? And so this is something I like to highlight when people talk about, oh, there's so much debate about, what's true, like right or wrong or good or bad, and it's like, yeah, but that's not a reason to be a skeptic of real kind of value and stuff like that. Yeah, and so like I love remembering just how thorny actual like scientific study is, and yet we are kind of happy to take on the assumption that we're still looking for real stuff, even though it's challenging. And then maybe there is just sort of this other kind of stuff that science helps us to understand, but we need our prehension, as Andrew Davies calls it, to really access truths about. Yeah, I think Chris had his hand up.
I definitely agree with that. Just I'll just say, and then I'll hand it to Chris. But no, because sort of I wrote down a sort of a gimme easy question that occurred to me, which was the difference people often claim between science and ethics or value is not that there's disagreement in one and not disagreement in the other, but that in ethics it seems particularly intractable. We don't even know how to solve the problem. But I think that you've already hit the response right on the head. Yeah, some scientific questions are easy to solve. You do an experiment and you settle it. But a lot of the higher level debates are just as intractable as ethics.
Right. And I think kind of equally, a lot of the really straightforward, there's at least some kind of ethical claims that there really isn't a lot of debate about. There really is a lot of agreement about. And so we have the like easy cases in both camps, and then we have the difficult cases in both camps. And like, yeah, as you say, they're much more parallel because people, I was inspired by an article by Brentford Bambrow called Proof, where he draws these parallels too, right? And it's like, well, people tend to pick really kind of consensus driven claims in science and contrast those with things like, abortion is immoral or something like that, highly contentious ethical claims. But you can do the flip, right? You can say, quantum physics is true versus gratuitous suffering is bad, and there's all sorts of disagreement over here, and so the idea that, don't be too select, right? Like if you kind of step back, you can see that there's a lot more parallels. And if you're kind of overly narrow in how you pick out your examples, then that can kind of pump your intuitions in the wrong way.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Thanks. Chris, over to you.
Yeah, I may be anticipating a question of Ted, a reaction of Ted, but certainly of your time in Bonn when I say, and so how about AI? We can see we can see those electrons, running around and the mechanics of it. But is this a species of life?
Well, I mean, that's one thing that AI ethicists study, right? What counts as life and what counts as intelligence? And one thing we've discovered is that we have a lot of biases that are kind of clouding our ability to reach really good understandings of these things. But we also do have, I think, when we're thinking about AI, one of the problems with AI is the opacity problem, right? Where when it comes to like machine learning, we don't actually understand all the intermediary processes, and so it's hard to predict outputs, it's hard to predict outcomes. And so they kind of mimic opacity if we're thinking about searching for life in the universe, and then understanding like even if we see a claim that seems like a straightforward mathematical claim, 2 + 2 = 4 or something, like equivalent, what actually is the understanding at work behind that, right? And that's, you know, that's just kind of the inaccessibility stuff. But yeah, so pinning down what life and intelligence are, it's relevant for astrobiology and SETI. It's also relevant for artificial intelligence. And I think, you know, it's a project that warrants a lot of continued effort. And so my, you know, my hope here is just to add something, you know, I'm not, you know, entirely convinced this is the correct way to understand life and intelligence, but I think it's something we should consider. I think it should be on the table as a possibility, given like a lot of the parallels that we see and given the possibilities for, you know, other stuff that really exists in this way, like maybe time or goodness or whatever. Yeah.
You raise the parallel with, in my mind, with neuroscience. We can see the active regions in the brain, but, you know, so we know where it's happening, but kind of what is it?
Yeah, yeah, and the consciousness problem too. Yeah, absolutely.
It's exactly that consciousness.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
No.
Good luck in Bonn. Great time.
Thank you. All important stuff to think about. Yeah, good.
Good. Does anybody else have any questions? Or shall we? Oh, Stephen, was there a hand there?
I think so.
Oh, he's waving in some way.
Oh, he's saying goodbye.
Oh, he's saying oh, okay. Yeah. I think, to be fair, I think I know. I think he has to pick up his kid at this time, I think. Well, yeah, no. I mean, I could continue to discuss this, Chelsea, but I think we'd end up going into far too much sort of detail on Kripke and all of those sorts of.
Sure. Yeah. No, the tigers is a good example. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, I'll send you an email afterwards.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, would love that.
Some interesting ideas there. Yeah.
Just a little thing that occurred to me at the beginning. Again, what are we going to, I suppose, recognize intelligence? Maybe we recognize it through technology and then most resonate with it through these values.
Yeah.
You know,
so the technology itself might be some indication of the values.
Well, no. Technology brings ETI to us. Mm-hmm. But then our resonance with the other will come, I think, more through our shared values. You know, so what is more, you know, our complete humanity, rather than just we're not just Homo technica, technical beings, but we have all kinds of aspects. And popped in my mind something that Margaret Rappaport and I shared, and that's, you know, the movie Arrival, and how the incredible technology there. Ted resonates with that incredible technology there, but where one really saw, and it was clear that this was life of some kind, but then how it was a shared life and shared values as how they protected the life of the heroine from the explosion, and one of them got mortally injured. So, you know, that there's that there is a real sharing, you know, a real resonance.
Yeah, and like, you know, we see evidence of values there, even if we don't see the value itself, just like we see evidence of, no, and I love that. You know, I had that little kind of symbol from Arrival in one of the slides. I don't know if you caught that. Because you know, it's a great example of, you know, there's just kind of the purely empirical project of like detecting, and you use all the science for that, and you know, for communicating too, but then there's these dimensions of value, I think, that are kind of overlaid, and I think the kind of stuff that we're really interested in, you know, as interesting as the technology and the discoveries of concrete things are, you know, we want to know about the possibilities for shared understandings, I think.
I think that's definitely true, because, you know, this search is one of the defining searches of the 20th and 21st centuries. In many ways, it's like a modern day sort of religious question. Are we alone in the universe? And oftentimes people don't necessarily know which they would prefer, whether we are or aren't, but they know they feel very strongly about it. Why do we care? it may not make much practical difference to our lives. It's not just
Right.
because we think they'll get us stuff. It's because it somehow means something. It's because, well, yes, we don't want to be
that's
alone.
right.
Yeah.
It's a
Why don't we
medium
want to be alone?
issue.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I think a lot of SETI practitioners think the most likely scenario is that we find evidence of, society. There's other extraterrestrial beings that are really far away or extant, and just knowing we're not alone is like itself very transformative, even if it has very little effect on our kind of everyday lives on
Right.
Earth.
Right.
So there's, and so, an arrival, they're here and communicating, but I think even something much more minimal could be really profound, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. No, I mean, and it's interesting then to think about, Arrival, but then other forms of fiction where they're, ones where, we get out there and we discover there were life forms, but they're all dead now. And there's something very evocative about that,
Yeah.
that we've missed that chance to relate to them too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it would be understandably kind of sad,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was sort of thinking about what you were saying about if we sort of just detect them, but we can't really communicate with them, but because it takes thousands of years for the message to get there. In some ways, it would mean something, but in other ways, it'd be so frustrating.
Or maybe, not as risky. Maybe people feel a little, there's all sorts of reasonable reactions to detection. But I think, whatever the reaction is, even kind of all sorts of reasonable and potentially conflicting reactions, it's just a profound kind of discovery. Yeah.
But Richard, the same thing, wouldn't we love to communicate with our, Homo ancestors?
I was thinking that exactly. I was
What,
thinking of the various cave paintings, where you see the
well,
mammoths
exactly.
and how
we can just guess. Yeah. Now.
Yeah. You sort of want to reach back and talk to them, but you can't.
Yeah. There's that other kind of value claim that Andrew talks about in his paper, which is, artistic value. And so, folks say that's one of the ways that we kind of manage a form of communication with our past, with our human ancestors, is through the art that they created. And so, in addition to looking for ethical value, axiological value, I mean, looking for artistic value, I think that's a, another kind of thing in that camp that's, worth exploring. And, it would be really, I think, interesting to find and also understand as art, extraterrestrial art, if it exists, right? But, given the possibilities for kind of communication through art in interesting ways. But yeah, that's just another of those like abstract platonic entities that maybe are universal.
So for the art in the lava tubes on the moon,
Art in the lava tubes, yeah. Well, then they're natural art, yeah. Yeah.
That's the place to live, apparently, anyway.
Right, shall we wrap up there? So I will say goodbye to our YouTube viewers, and then if we want, we can chat after I stop recording. So thank you everybody on YouTube for watching this. I hope you enjoyed it. I don't think we have any talks scheduled for a month or two now. I think we're having a bit of a break over Christmas, but I'm sure we'll have some exciting stuff for you in 2023. So do like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video whenever that is.
Thanks.